The paradoxical self-entrapment of the ego. The ego is a set of thought patterns, memories, identifications, and automatic reactions that create the illusion of a distinct, autonomous entity. Although it is an illusion, it has an apparent functionality, because it can analyze, plan, fear, hope, all of this mechanically for the purpose of self-preservation. The ego, although non-existent as a real entity, behaves as if it were existent and independent. Its very structure pushes it to reproduce and reinforce its illusion. It fears its annihilation, death, non-existence, not because there is any real entity that will be lost, but because the very thought that composes the ego contains the illusion of I exist. This also explains nervousness in social interactions. The ego is designed to protect its position in the social fabric, to manage impressions, to ensure its survival through social interactions. Whenever it feels threatened, for example by rejection, humiliation, loss of prestige, a deep fear is activated because, in the context of its self-deception, these threats resemble existential danger. The ego constantly chases wealth, or more generally success and recognition, because its very nature is built on the feeling of lack and fear. The sense of lack. The ego is born when the child begins to develop a sense of separate self. I am here and the world is out there. This sense of separation creates an underlying fear that something is missing, something is needed to feel complete. Wealth, material goods, and social recognition seem like ways to fill this inner sense of emptiness. The problem is that this lack is inherent in the ego's illusion. No matter how much it acquires, the feeling of inadequacy returns because true fullness cannot be found outside of the self. So the hunt continues endlessly. Fear of insecurity and death. The ego knows on some unconscious level that it is temporary and vulnerable. It fears decay, failure, loneliness, and ultimately death. The accumulation of wealth and material possessions gives an illusion of control and security. If I have enough money, I won't have to fear the future. If others admire me, I won't feel alone or insignificant. However, because this security is based on external factors, it is always fragile and temporary, so the ego feels compelled to keep chasing more. The programming of society. Society instills in us from a young age the idea that our worth depends on what we have and what we achieve. Advertising, social media, and role models reinforce the idea that the more I have, the more I am worth. The ego takes this belief and uses it as fuel for the relentless pursuit of wealth. The need for recognition and identity. The ego doesn't just want to survive. It wants to stand out, to be important and unique. Wealth becomes a symbol of prestige and power that affirms its identity. If I have money, others will respect me. This desire for external validation gives rise to the nervousness and anxiety we discussed earlier. The ego fears rejection because it is tantamount to a threat to its very existence. How this relates to awakening. The pursuit of wealth is actually a misguided quest for inner fulfillment. The ego tries to fill the void of alienation with external things, but this strategy never works because the sense of I am incomplete is part of the ego's very identity. When one begins to see that one's true nature is already complete and free, the compulsive pursuit of wealth and recognition begins to relax. This does not mean that the awakened being rejects wealth, but wealth ceases to be the center of identity and the vehicle of happiness. True freedom comes when you realize that you don't need anything from the world to be whole. Awareness itself is already complete. The parable of the rich fool and Jesus' phrase, "For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his own soul?" Matthew 16:26, are of deep spiritual significance and are directly connected to the teaching of non-identification with the ego. What does it mean to lose your soul? The soul in this context does not refer to some material or eternal entity that is lost at death. Rather, it symbolizes the true essence of man, the deeper truth that lies beyond the identities of the ego. To lose your soul is to cut yourself off from this inner essence and live immersed in the illusion of the ego. When a person lives solely for the accumulation of wealth, fame, and social recognition, he becomes a slave to fear and desire. All his actions are determined by what he will gain, and how others will see him. In this state, a person becomes so identified with his ego that he loses touch with his deepest inner presence, the awareness that is free, peaceful, and self-sufficient. The ego's deception and the search for external affirmation. The ego believes that if it acquires enough material goods and social acceptance, it will find security and happiness. However, this search never ends, because the ego lives through the feeling of lack. Even when it obtains what it desires, it is afraid of losing it. Thus, it constantly lives in a state of anxiety and dissatisfaction. The rich fool in Jesus' parable accumulated goods and felt that he had secured his future. But that night, death came, the ultimate limit that the ego cannot cross. There, the futility of all accumulation is revealed. Everything he built concerned the temporary and ephemeral, while his true essence was neglected. Awakening. Through the awareness of impermanence, this teaching is an invitation to turn to the eternal and unchanging within, the awareness that is not dependent on any external condition. When a person recognizes that their true nature is already complete and self-sufficient, the need for wealth and affirmation loses its power. Wealth and success may or may not exist, but they no longer determine a sense of worth and fulfillment. This teaching shows that the true self can never be lost, because it is the very awareness in which the world appears. But the ego, because it lives in the illusion of separation, believes that it must possess the world in order to feel complete. Awakening occurs when we see that completion is not found outside, but in the recognition that we already are what we seek. So Jesus' phrase is a reminder: do not exchange the truth of who you are for the illusion of temporary ego success. The automatic acting and awakening. The unawakened person functions as if he were a subordinate of this ego structure. He observes the ego's patterns, but he identifies completely with them, thinking that he thinks, he decides, he desires. He does not see that the ego is a self-regulating system of thoughts programmed by his past. When awakening occurs, the individual realizes that he is not the ego, but the awareness within which the ego appears and functions. From that moment on, instead of being a subordinate of the ego, he begins to observe it detachedly, seeing its automatic nature. This detachment is the beginning of freedom. The relation to the Oedipus tragedy. Oedipus, being immersed in ignorance, acts mechanically, following patterns that are beyond his control. He kills his father and marries his mother without knowing what he is doing. When the truth is revealed, the shock is so strong that he tries to punish himself by gouging out his eyes, not understanding the deeper nature of existence. Similarly, the person who suddenly realizes that his ego was an illusion may go through a stage of guilt, fear, or confusion. He may try to fight the ego or suppress it. But true understanding lies not in the destruction of the ego, but in the profound realization that he was never the real self. The final stage, from delusion to liberation. Liberation comes when we understand that we do not need to destroy the ego, but simply see it clearly for the illusion that it is. The ego continues to function, but it no longer has the same power. Fears, desires, social anxieties may appear, but they are not its. They are simply phenomena that occur in awareness. Just as the sea is not afraid of the waves, so awareness is not afraid of the ego. When this becomes clear, a deep inner peace arises.
But it is difficult for a person to awaken as long as he believes in his thoughts and beliefs. Right? What else is stopping him?
Deep belief in thoughts and beliefs is one of the main reasons that awakening seems difficult. The ego lives through identification with thoughts. That is, when one believes that I am my thoughts, I am my beliefs, then one cannot see their impersonal, transient nature. But that's not the only thing that prevents awakening. There are other deeper mechanisms that trap people in non-awakening. Let's look at them one by one. The deep-rooted fear of extinction. The ego fears that if it awakens, it will disappear. This is the primal fear. If I let go of the ego, then who will I be? The truth is that nothing real is lost, only the illusion collapses. But because the ego is identified with existence, any threat to it is perceived as an existential threat. The habit of identifying with the mind. From childhood, man is taught to rely on his mind to understand the world. Instead of seeing the mind as a tool, he sees it as himself. When the time comes to distance himself from thoughts, he feels as if he is being asked to give up his own identity. Emotional attachments. Our identities and beliefs are not just logical constructs, they are emotionally charged. A person who has built their life around the idea of being someone, of having a specific value, role, or mission, has difficulty letting go of that identity. Any attempt to detach can bring insecurity, sadness, or even mourning for the old me. Society's programming. Society constantly reinforces the illusion of the ego. From a young age, we are taught that you are your name, your successes, your failures, your morals, your history. Anything that contradicts this programming initially seems incomprehensible or even dangerous. The mechanism of desire and fear. The ego operates through two basic forces. Desire. I want something to feel complete, safe, satisfied. Fear. I am afraid that something will harm me, diminish me, destroy me. This mechanism keeps a person constantly busy, without giving them space to see what they really are. It's like chasing shadows. They always think that happiness or fulfillment is in the next achievement, the next success, the next relationship. The delusion of the search. Even when a person begins to seek the truth, the ego often turns the search into a new identity. He becomes the seeker, the spiritual person, the one who wants to reach enlightenment. This new identity can become another obstacle, because it is still based on the same illusion of the existence of a distinct I who wants to reach somewhere.
What can one do to see through these delusions?
The first step is deep observation. If one begins to observe one's thoughts without identifying with them, one will see that they come and go on their own. There is no someone producing them. They are simply automated processes of the mind. The second step is to explore the very sense of I. Where exactly do we find it within ourselves? If we ask, "Who am I?" and look beyond thoughts, beliefs, and identities for the answer, we will find something that is always present. Pure awareness, the unchanging being. Awakening is not a matter of effort, but of breaking down the obstacles that hide it. It is already here. What is needed is to see what we are not, and the truth reveals itself, created by illusory.